Well, welcome back, everyone. We hope that you had a great little break. Now, what we're going to do, since Nikki and Flo set us up so well in terms of understanding the importance of the FSAID and its connection to the FAFSA, let's talk about the FAFSA itself. And as you all know, the FAFSA was updated last year, and it has been a little bit of a challenge. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the FAFSA. We're going to talk about signing in, dependency determination, and then the student and parent questions. We're going to use a dependent student scenario today. There are other scenarios, but this is the one that we seem to hit the most. So we are going to go through that today. And then after the FAFSA has been submitted, we're going to talk about what happens then, how people can check the status of the FAFSA, how they can make corrections, and then a few additional troubleshooting tips. I'm going to try to work in a lot of troubleshooting as we go through the walkthrough, but a few extras at the end. So with that, one of the things I want you to know is that you always go to studentaid.gov to do anything federal student aid related, to sign into the FAFSA, to do any loan related stuff. But there are multiple ways you can get into a FAFSA once you're there. So one of the things that you can do is you can simply log in, as you can see here, or create an account if you haven't yet, and then click on FAFSA form. But there are multiple ways. They tried to make it as easy as possible for people to access the FAFSA. Now, one of the big changes with the FAFSA for the 24-25 year is that the FAFSA became a roles-based form. Prior to that, the FAFSA was one application that had a student section and a parent section, but it was all one application. And now what's happening is there is a student section and there's a parent section. And these are two separate sections, but they are connected to each other. And they are connected via the invite that we're going to talk about in a moment and do some troubleshooting around the invite, because this is a problematic piece in some cases, okay? The invite, again, is what connects those two sections, but either individual, the student or the parent, can start the FAFSA. Whoever starts the FAFSA will invite the other party to complete their section of the FAFSA. Okay, so one of the most important things before a FAFSA is even started is deciding who is going to start it. The recommendation initially was to have the student start it. We have seen it work in both cases. So I don't have a recommendation as to who should. I think it really depends on the specific situation, and we've seen it work well in both scenarios. So again, for today's walkthrough, we're going to do a scenario where the student is the one that's starting the FAFSA. So the student is going to click on, if they're already logged in, they're going to click on Start a New Form. If they're not logged in yet, then they'll be taken to studentaid.gov and see this login screen. Now, as a reminder, as Nikki and Flo mentioned in their session, if someone doesn't remember their username, they can sign in using a verified email, or they can sign in using a verified cell phone number. So those options work. If they can't remember any of that, they can simply click on Forgot My Username, and they can walk through a process to retrieve their username. If they can remember their username, but not their password, then they can click on Forgot My Password, and they will have the opportunity to reset their password, to create a new password. Again, if someone has not even created an account yet, they will do that first. And when logging in, people are always required to confirm contact information. So that's a standard part of the process now. One of the things that happened with last year's revised FAFSA is now every time an FSAID is used by the parent or the student, the two-step verification process is required. I've almost forgotten this now, but there was a time when parents didn't have to verify, do a two-step verification to complete the parent part of the FAFSA. But now every time anyone signs in to studentaid.gov and does anything, two-step verification is required. Why this is such a big deal is, for example, my son needs to get his FAFSA done. Yes, I know he's not going to school this fall, but you think he's going to continue on. So I want him to get his FAFSA done. I can't just do his FAFSA because he has ruined his cell phone yet again and doesn't have access to his cell phone, nor does he have easy access to his email, at least not easy right now. I can't just go in and do that for him anymore. every time anyone signs in, they need to do that two-step verification. So that's been kind of frustrating for parents out there who just want to do everything themselves. They can't anymore. They have to have their student engaged at least enough to provide the student's username and password, and have them available to provide the code so that they can get into the FAFSA. So the recommendation is that the student complete the student section and the parent complete the parent section. It's going to make it a lot easier, but we are also realistic enough to know that this isn't always what happens. So when the student decides to go ahead and start the FAFSA, in this case, the student is going to select that they are the student. But keep in mind, and Nikki mentioned this, that I can be both a student and a parent. So I can be a student myself, in which case, if I want to do a FAFSA for myself, I'm going to indicate that I'm the student, or perhaps I'm the parent I want to complete the parent section of my student's FAFSA. Okay, so that's why this question is asked, is because an individual could be either or both of these things. But in this scenario, we are having the student start the FAFSA. So I decided when putting this presentation together that I was going to include all of the various screenshots you would see walking through this process. Some of them I'm not going to talk about a lot, but what I wanted you to be able to see was the actual flow of questions and be able to look at them so that you could see the wording of particular questions, even if they weren't questions that are particularly confusing, but you just wanted to know how that question was worded. So what you're going to find as I go through this is going to be a few slides I'm going to spend a bit of time on, but a lot of the slides I'm just going to mention very briefly. So, for example, one of the things I want you to know is that when they log in for the first time, when the student does the FAFSA for the first time, they're going to see 4 onboarding pages. I'm not going to show you all of those today, but know that most of the questions students have are answered in these videos, these 4 short videos. I think virtually everyone just skips over them, but there's great information in these if people want to check them out. So after those videos, the first thing that happens is they want to make sure that the person who is signed in is that person and has all of their information correct. Now, what you're going to find when the student logged in with their FSA ID, it pulled over their information from their FSA ID. As Nikki mentioned when she did her session, these things are totally integrated behind the scenes. The FAFSA and the FSA ID information are connected. So when a student signs in with their FSA ID, it automatically is going to pre-populate all of these pieces of information. Now, if a piece of information is wrong, so for example, if the student's name has changed, then what they need to do is they need to go back to studentaid.gov and make corrections there. Just like they showed you in the last presentation, you go in to studentaid.gov and you go under settings and you update that information. Updating it in the FSA ID information, once it's been verified, will then result in it being updated in the FAFSA. Okay, so these two things have to stay in sync, and you're almost forced into making them stay in sync because you cannot make an update to information here. You have to go back to the FSA ID. One of the other significant changes that happened last year is that information is coming over directly from the IRS in terms of tax information, when there is tax information that exists. So, as Nikki mentioned, the IRS can't just share information. We have to give permission for our information to be shared and to be transmitted into the FAFSA. So, every individual, every single person that is logging in with an FSA ID has to provide consent for the FAFSA to go talk to the IRS, pull over any tax information, or confirm that there is no tax information on file. So everybody has to provide consent. So if you have a student, for example, that says, well, I don't need to provide consent because I didn't file taxes. Yes, they do. Everybody has to provide consent so that tax information can be pulled over, but also a critical part of this process is verifying that there is no tax information on file for other individuals. So everybody must provide consent. If the student does have tax information, same with the parent, then it's going to pull over automatically, which is going to make this process so much easier. It will pull over automatically in most cases, few exceptions to that I'll touch on in a moment. Okay, so everyone needs to provide consent. This page is super long. Here's the bottom part of that page. And what they just need to do is they need to click on approve. If they decline this, then the student is ineligible for federal student aid. So I can't emphasize this enough. Everybody has to provide consent. Not providing consent, even if you don't file taxes, results in the student being ineligible. The good news is we did not seem to have as many issues with this year as I thought we might. So people seem to be okay with going ahead and providing consent. So the first thing that you are going to see, if you are a student completing the FAFSA, in terms of sections, but also if you're a parent doing the FAFSA, is first you need to determine whether or not a student is going to be considered independent or dependent. So the first set of questions are going to determine the student's dependency status. So these are the personal circumstance questions. If a student can answer yes to any one of these questions that we're going to review momentarily, then they are considered to be independent. If the student cannot answer yes to any of these questions, then they are considered dependent and are going to need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. So what are these questions? First of all, is the student single or married? If a student is married, they are automatically going to be considered independent. But not surprisingly, many of our traditional age students are not married. Okay, so typically oftentimes that's going to be single. So that doesn't mean, that means that they're still on the path to being considered dependent. Another question that they will answer to determine dependency status is what year in school are they? So if a student is a graduate student, they are automatically considered to be independent. But in this scenario, we're saying that the student is a first year student. So they are still on that pathway to being a dependent student. Okay. Now it does ask whether they're a first year student, second year student, or other undergrad. And that's because loan eligibility varies a little bit depending on your grade level. So that's the reason why they ask for that breakdown. There's not as much of a breakdown as there used to be, but the student does want to indicate which year in school they're going to be, and that will determine what their federal student loan eligibility will be. I do also want to call attention to this question here. When the student starts the 24-25 FAFSA school year, will they have their bachelor's degree? This is one of those questions we want to be sure that people who don't have a bachelor's degree make sure that they answer this question no. You'd be surprised how many high school seniors answer yes to this question. And if you answer yes to this question, you're ineligible for a federal Pell Grant and for a Maine State Grant. So it's really important that people read these questions and that students who don't have a bachelor degree click no or select no for that one. Now, I recognize, especially with my eyes these days, that I cannot see all of these questions super well, but you will have this in a PDF so you can blow it up and make it big. But these are the other questions that determine whether or not a student is going to be considered dependent. So I'm just going to look through these really quickly with you. So basically, if the student is on active duty for purposes other than training, they would be automatically considered independent. If the student is a veteran, they are going to automatically be considered independent. If the student has children who live with them and receive more than half their support from them and will continue to, then the student is considered independent. If a student anytime since they've turned 13 was an orphan, they're considered independent. If the student anytime since they turned 13 was a ward of the court, they're considered independent. If a student anytime since they turned 13 were in foster care, even if they're no longer in foster care, they're automatically considered independent. If the student is or was legally an emancipated minor, because of course, once they've turned 18, they're not a minor, but if they were an emancipated minor, they are considered independent automatically. And if the student is or was in the legal guardianship of someone other than their biological parent or step parent or adoptive parent, then they too are automatically considered independent. So I wanted to just take a moment and go through those because we have a lot of students out there who have very difficult situations. And what we want them to know is that there often is a way for them to actually get through the FAFSA process pretty easily. So when we have students that we're working with and we do a financial aid night, for example, very often we will have a grandparent say to us, I have my grandchild living with me. How do they complete the FAFSA? And one of the questions I'm going to ask them first always is, do you have legal guardianship? Because if the grandparent does have legal guardianship, when the student says yes to this question on the FAFSA, they are automatically considered independent and no parent information is required on the FAFSA. If they say no, we're going to get to that in a moment. Okay. So this is another one of those circumstances where answering yes to any of these questions results in the student being independent. So the other category, one of the other categories where students need to answer questions is about whether or not they are considered an unaccompanied minor or they are homeless and, excuse me, let me read this the way it's written. The student was unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. So the FAFSA over the last several years has gone a long way to recognize that we have an increasing number of students who are homeless or at risk of being homeless. So when students fill out the FAFSA, many students are going to answer no to this question. They're going to stay on the pathway to being considered dependent. But we have a significant and unfortunately an increasing number of students who say, yeah, that is my situation. So what happens then? If the student says yes, I am a student who is unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, then what they are going to see is they are going to see a variety of opportunities to indicate who can verify this. So, for example, the most common situation we see is that a student says, yes, I am homeless. One of the things we're going to say to them, can your high school liaison verify that? If they can, then the student would click that box, and guess what? They are automatically considered to be independent. Okay. They don't have to see any additional questions beyond that related to parents. They're automatically considered independent, and this is considered verified. They should not have to provide additional documentation, although some schools may request it. Okay, they're on that automatic path to independence. But what if no one can verify that? So let's say that we have a student who is 21. They are not meeting any of the other criteria to be considered independent, but there's no one that can verify that they were or are currently homeless. They've been out of high school for a few years. They're not connected with any of these organizations. Then what do? They can still say no. And then what's going to happen is they're going to be considered what is referred to now as provisionally independent. So they're going to be able to go ahead and to complete their FAFSA, and they won't have to provide any parent information, but they will have to follow up with the financial aid office. So the financial aid office is going to work with them to gather whatever information is needed, and it should be limited to only what is actually needed to determine whether or not they actually are going to be considered independent. Okay. So imagine for now, the student said no to the homeless question. They are still on that pathway to being considered dependent. But there's one more question that's going to determine that. Actually, two, because if they're 24, they're automatically considered independent as well. But this is the last question they're going to see that's going to determine their dependency status. And it's asking them if they have any unusual circumstances. So let's go back now to the situation where I mentioned that the grandparent has the student living with them, but the grandparent has never legally adopted the student, okay, because then they'd be dependent, or the grandparent doesn't have legal guardianship, in which case the student would automatically be independent. The grandparent is just providing housing and taking care of that child, but nothing legally has happened. This is a situation where we would want to dive deeper, and we get personal very quickly in financial aid, and we're going to ask more about the circumstances. So for example, if that student is living with a grandparent, maybe because the parents, the biological parents, have some challenges. Maybe there's some drug issues. Maybe the parent is incarcerated. Maybe there was abuse, and so the child left the household because it wasn't safe for them. Those are considered unusual circumstances. Think of unusual circumstances as the student can't answer any of the questions yes that would make them automatically independent, but the reality is their situation is such that they shouldn't have to provide parent information, or they can't even locate their parent in some cases. So you're going to see here a list of situations that are examples of what are considered unusual circumstances. So left home due to an abusive or threatening environment, or abandoned or estranged from their parents, or have are refugee or asylum status and are separated from their parents, are victims of human trafficking, their parent is incarcerated, or they basically can't even find or locate their parents, okay? So when we have students in these really difficult situations, they can check yes to this question. And then, like the homeless student who can't get that verification from one of those identified authorities, they will be considered provisionally independent, which means they will be able to go ahead and complete their FAFSA. No parent information will be required, but they are going to need to follow up with the financial aid office so that the financial aid office can verify their situation and document their situation. Okay? If the student is not a student that's experiencing unusual circumstances, then what they are going to see is that they are going to be considered a dependent student. So if they were unable to answer yes to any of those questions that we just talked about, and they're not 24 and they're not a grad student, then they are going to be considered dependent for the purposes of the FAFSA and are going to be required to provide parent information. Jess, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one note when we talk about legal guardianship. It does say court-appointed legal guardianship, and that is the vast majority of legal guardianships are court-appointed. They had to be gone through the courts, but there are some scenarios where family members might, just through a lawyer, not necessarily through the courts, have changed legal guardianship. So I worked with a family who wanted to send their kid to Maine to come to school, so an aunt and uncle took legal guardianship. That kind of more personal legal guardianship situation does not disqualify the student from needing their parents' information on the FAFSA form.
Great point, Jess. Yes, all of this is legal. This is going through the courts. This is not just, oh, I can, this person can sign the paperwork for a student at school. This is legally gone through the court appointed guardianship. Okay. All right. So if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will address them. But that's how a student is determined to be independent or dependent. If the student is considered to be dependent, they're going to see this question, which probably of all of the questions on the FAFSA caused some of the most confusion and unintended consequences this year. This question is simply asking a dependent student if they cannot provide parent information. So let's just say this is a scenario where the student, it says, looks like you're dependent, right? You couldn't answer yes to any of the questions. So you're going to need to provide parent information. If you can't do that, right? So let's just say dad says, I'm not going to provide information. The student does have the opportunity to say, I can't provide parent information. I don't meet any of the criteria to be independent, but I can't provide parent information. So they could say yes and be considered for an unsubsidized loan only. So this is what the federal government did to acknowledge the fact that there are sometimes situations where students can't get parent information, but there aren't these unusual circumstances. And so they have made it possible for those students to get an unsubsidized loan only, but no Pell Grant, no Maine State Grant, no other financial aid at all, okay, from the federal government or from the state. So that's really important for students to know that. So they revised this question, so it's a little bit better. I think they're going to do a little bit more for the coming year, but students should be answering no to this question, okay? They do not want an unsubsidized loan only. They want to be considered for all of the types of financial aid that are available. So the only students that would answer yes to this are those hopefully handful of students whose parents are just not willing to provide information, but there are no unusual circumstances. Everybody else should answer no, so that they can continue on and be considered for all types of aid. If you have a student that inadvertently answers yes to that, they can go back and correct that after their FAFSA has, even after their FAFSA has been submitted. Okay. So the student is saying, no, I don't want to be considered for unsub only. I want to be considered for all of the various types of aid possible. So therefore, I need to provide information about my parents. So what we have to do first is they have to indicate whether or not their parents are married to each other. So we're talking biological or adopted parents. Are their parents married to each other? Because this gets to what Nikki talked about in terms of who has to have an FSA ID. So if I say yes, the parents are married to each other, then we need to provide information about both parents. There are a couple other scenarios here that I'm not going to go through today, but they're basically, it's a series of skip logic questions that directs the student to know who has to provide information on the FAFSA. So in this case, parents are married to each other, so information for both parents needs to be provided. This screen here is so critical and so important, but also is where we had so many issues this year. So I think they've made it better. But what happens on this screen is we have a scenario in this that we're going through today where the parents are married to each other, right? But when the student fills out this screen, they only want to provide information for one parent. Okay, so that's confusing, and I don't know why they've set it up this way. So if we've got a situation where parents are married to each other and they file the joint tax return, information for both parents is going to be required on the FAFSA, but only one parent should need an FSA ID. That parent who has an FSA ID is who should be listed here. So only list one parent here. And you can see, they even say, we highly recommend you only complete the parent who will fill out this form for one parent, okay? The reason this is so critical is this invite is what connects the parent section and the student section of the FAFSA together. So what happens is when you go in and you put information in this form, okay, and so here's the bottom part of it, the student is going to be putting in their parents, because this is the students starting the FAFSA, the student is going to be putting in their parents' date of birth, social security number, assuming that they have one, email address, and then they're going to confirm the email address. What's happening behind the scenes is it's looking at FSA ID information, and therefore it has to match exactly. If it doesn't match exactly, you're going to get an error message and you're not going to be able to continue to finish off the FAFSA. So this is absolutely critical. So the name needs to be the legal name that was on the FSA ID and that was matched with the Social Security Administration. The date of birth needs to be correct, as well as the Social Security number. The email doesn't have to be the same email that's in the FSA ID. And that's because I might have my personal email in my FSA ID, but my student's going to be able to get me to read an email quicker if they send it to my work email, okay? So the email does not have to match what's in the FSA ID, but everything else has to, okay? So this form, this particular screen is critical because it's this that connects the student FAFSA section of the FAFSA, because that's what we're doing right now. This is how it knows who the parent is on the FAFSA. If the parent had started the FAFSA, they would provide this information about the students, and that's how the two parts would get connected. So please be sure that everything is correctly entered. And if the parent doesn't have a social security number, click on this box. And instead of providing some of the other information like social, the mailing address would be required. All right. So once this is all filled in.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Sure.
Just
Yeah.
reiterate. So both parents, you live with both parents, they're married, they have to provide their tax information. And, but only one needs an FSA ID. Is that correct?
If the parents are married to each other and file a joint tax return, only one needs an FSA ID.
Okay,
If parents are married to each other, but for some reason decide to file separate tax returns, then both parents need an FSA ID. The key piece of the FSA ID, beyond being the legal signature and all of those other things, comes back to the consent. If I'm married and I file a joint tax return and I'm filling out a FAFSA for my son, only I need to have an FSA ID, because by virtue of filing a joint tax return with my husband, I can grant consent for both of us.
okay.
If for some reason we file taxes separately, I cannot grant consent on his behalf. So both of us would need an FSA ID in that situation.
But in this form right here that
Mhm.
that you pick one of the parents?
Right. You're still just going to put in one, and you're
Okay,
going to put in the one for that parent. If you only need one parent with an FSA ID, put that parent and its information in there. Still only put in one parent.
okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And please do jump in. Raise your hand. I am paying attention so I can see if someone raises their hand. But do just what you did. If there's any questions that as I'm going through this, I want you to jump in with them. Okay. Or put them in the chat as well. All right. Before I move on from this absolutely critical page, are there any questions or anything that you want to clarify from my team? Okay. So that section gets completed. The parent invite gets sent. The invite gets sent immediately. Okay. So immediately the parent should get an email, and another piece of information will change, so that they can go and complete their parent section. I recommend that they wait, let the student get their FAFSA part completed, and then have the parent go in and do their section. And we're going to walk through how that works in just a moment. Okay. But the student is the one that's finishing their FAFSA. So we've determined that the student is dependent. We provided some basic parent information. The parent invite has been sent. And so now the student can finish off and provide the rest of the required information on their FAFSA. So you can kind of see here on this box what information is required for the student. So they're going to need to provide their personal circumstances, which they've done, some demographic information, some financial information. They're going to list their colleges, and then they're going to sign their FAFSA. So I'm going to go through these slides really quickly. I included them because I want you to have them as reference, but these are pretty straightforward. So the student is going to indicate their gender and their race and ethnicity. In both cases, they can say prefer not to answer. In all cases, this information is not shared with the school or anybody else. Okay. So students don't need to worry that answering these questions is going to result in something negative happening or some determinations being made about their financial aid based on the answers of these questions. These questions are not shared with anyone. Federal student aid is just simply collecting them because, for research purposes, they're using the information, but it has no impact whatsoever on financial aid eligibility. And at the end of the day, if the student wants to say, I just prefer not to answer, they can do that. No impact, no negative impact on their financial aid eligibility. The student will then answer their citizenship status. If they're a U.S. citizen, they will click that box. If they're an eligible non-citizen, when they click on that box, another question will appear, and it will ask them to enter their A number. So students who are eligible non-citizens want to be sure that they have their A number with them when they're going to fill out their FAFSA. Ulrika mentioned this, but if you go to famemaine.com/new Mainers, we have a section on that part of the website where there's skip logic and people can determine whether or not they're an eligible non-citizen. So we encourage you, if you're working with someone who is unsure whether or not they're eligible or not, those questions will basically go in sequence and ask them certain things. And if they can say yes to any of them, they're considered an eligible non-citizen. If they can't answer yes to any of them, then they are not an eligible non-citizen. So we'd love to have you check that out. Parents' education status, again, they use this for research purposes. We in Maine don't use it for anything else. Some states do use it for determining money for first-generation students, but here in Maine, we do not. So just have them answer that question, but know that it has no impact. And then there is a question about parents being killed in the line of duty. If a parent is killed in the line of duty, it does have, it potentially opens up Pell Grant eligibility, even for families who financially would not otherwise be eligible for a Pell Grant. So if a parent was killed, overseas, or is a firefighter or a police officer and was killed in the line of duty, then those students are potentially going to be eligible for Pell Grant, even if financially their circumstances are such that they wouldn't otherwise be eligible. So that's why that question is asked. Hopefully most of our students can answer no to that question, because that would be a difficult situation for them, losing their parent. The next set of questions have to do with high school completion status. So basically, if a student is a high school graduate, then what they're going to find is they're going to want information about their high school. So you can see the screenshots here, but they can basically search for their high school, and then they will confirm their high school. If a student is homeschooled or got a GED, they would never even see these questions. Okay, so these questions about high school are only displayed to students who who received a high school diploma. Others would not even see these questions. So then students are going to move into the financial section of the FAFSA. If the student filed taxes for the appropriate year, so keep in mind the tax year is the prior tax year. So if we're doing a 24-25 FAFSA, then look at that first year, 24, and prior year taxes are what are required. So for the 24-25 FAFSA, it was 22 income. For the upcoming year, the 25-26 FAFSA, it's going to be 2023 income. Okay, but it tells them, here which year they're looking at. If the student did file taxes in 2022 and provided consent, their tax information will come over directly from the IRS. So they do not need to enter that information. One of the things, though, that we found was confusing this year is it came over, but it's not viewable. So you will never, ever see any of the federal tax information display in the FAFSA or on the FAFSA submission summary. Okay, the IRS, again, very protective of this information. So in the FAFSA and in the FAFSA submission summary, you will never see this information. The schools will see that tax information, of course, because they need to, but others won't. We, even at FAME, don't see that data anymore. Okay, so very protected. So if you have parents who are concerned about people seeing their tax information, no one other than the schools that the students apply to and list on their FAFSA will be able to see any of their tax information. Additionally, students won't be able to see their parents' tax information. So that's comforting to some parents. So if students didn't file taxes, okay, that gets verified, and they will still only see these two questions. No longer are students and parents who don't file taxes having to answer any questions about their earnings. So in the past, which seems like a long time ago, students who didn't file taxes had to indicate what their earnings were. That is no longer the case. They removed that question from the FAFSA. Okay, so these are the only two questions that the student should see if they provided consent and if their FSA ID had been authenticated. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If that was not the case, then they will have to enter their tax information manually if they indeed file taxes. Okay. When the students create their FSA ID, and parents, we recommend that they do that at least 3 days before they're going to file a FAFSA. Because in order for tax information to come over, the FSA ID has to be authenticated or verified. That's that 1 to 3 day match that happens with the Social Security Administration. When we were actually doing FAFSAs with students this year, there were some cases where the student had done nothing. So we went ahead, we created an FSA ID, and we might have even gone ahead and said, let's start the FAFSA, because maybe they didn't file taxes, so it didn't matter. Or maybe they did file taxes, but they were okay with entering it manually. That is an option, but the best case scenario, and what we're going to focus on again this fall, is making sure that people get their FSA IDs ahead of time so they have time to get authenticated so that the information comes over from the IRS, which is going to make things much easier to complete. Students will provide asset information in most circumstances, unless their parents meet the criteria for not having to provide assets. But if the student is doing the FAFSA first, those questions haven't been answered yet. So please have them go ahead and answer these 3 questions. These 3 questions are as of the day that they file the FAFSA. You know, what do they have in cash, savings, and checking, for example. If the criteria is met by the parents that assets are excluded, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, then assets for the student will be excluded as well. So even though they were provided, they will be ignored if asset information isn't required based on that family's situation. And then the last step in the process for providing information is to select the colleges. So students will go ahead and they will list any colleges that they want this information sent to. So what we want students to do is we want them to list all of the schools that they potentially want to receive this FAFSA information, even if they haven't applied to them. Every school that that's a possibility. Now students can list up to 20 schools on the FAFSA. Used to be 10, but now they can list 20. And then what the student is going to see is this summary of all of the information that they provided. They can click on this little piece here, and it will open up those questions. They can review them. They can edit them. They can do what is necessary. Now, one of the things that's been confusing this year is, wouldn't you think you could click right here and get to the signature? That's not how it works. Instead, this is all one long page. The student has to scroll all the way down to the bottom and click continue, okay? This is not an arrow that opens up this opportunity. Instead, they have to scroll all the way down and click on continue. Once they do that, that is where they can, they will see this, they will click on this box and they will sign their FAFSA. Whoever is the first individual, student in this case, to complete their section of the FAFSA can sign it. What happens is then when the parent comes in and provides their information and they're going to sign and submit the FAFSA. So the last person in will have the opportunity to sign and submit. Okay. Oops. All right. So then what the student sees is this. You're almost there. Your student section is complete, but you do need to have your parent provide their information. So what the student will see here is that they invited their contributor, their parent, who has the FSA ID, and they can see that that invitation was sent. Now, there's a little known thing, or maybe you've noticed it, at the bottom of this page. Okay, so this page here is a long page. This is the bottom half of this page. They're going to see basically information about their FAFSA submission summary, but there is also a link down here. If I click on that provide parent information manually, as a student, I can answer questions on my parent's behalf. I cannot sign the FAFSA on their behalf. They're still going to have to log in and provide their FSA ID and sign the FAFSA. But for those students or parents, whichever way, whoever starts, the other individual can answer questions for them. We don't recommend this, but sometimes we have had FAFSAs that we're just having a terrible time getting through or having someone else get access. So this is one of those troubleshooting things that you could try if all else has failed, okay? Best case scenario, student does their section, parent does their section. But if you're having issues, you can try this as another option. Or sometimes we have students that are just driving the whole bus and their parents will go in and sign in with their FSA ID, but they're not willing to do anything more. The challenge when you do this, though, is that you're going to have to manually enter all the tax information, okay? Because the FSA ID information hasn't been entered for the parent can't provide consent yet, and the parent tax information can't come over manually. But it is a good back of your pocket tool if you are running into situations where the FAFSA completion process is just not working well. All right, so where we're at is the student has filled out their section of the FAFSA, which is including having sent an invite to their parent. So the parent would have gotten an email at whatever address was used, email address was used, did not have to be the one that matched the FSA ID. And so they can click on the link in the email. That's option number 1. Option number 2, which is what I tended to do with families because I thought it was easier, the parent can just go directly to studentaid.gov and log in with their FSA ID. I will say I had a student recently where the invite was sent, but we weren't seeing it in FSA in the studentaid.gov. So we did have to have them click on the link in the email. But what I have found that's worked best is I don't even worry about the email. I just typically have the parent go directly to studentaid.gov and log in with their FSA ID. When the parent logs in with their FSA ID, Rebecca, by the way, is my sister, what they're going to see is that Ellie sent her the invite, okay? And so she has a pending invitation. So this is on the dashboard. So she can see that she has a pending invite. When she clicks on that, she sees this here. And hopefully you can't hear my dogs barking. She sees that there's an invitation sent, and she will go ahead and she will accept this invitation. If people click on the link in the email, they will log in and do the same thing, okay? So they can see the invite on the dashboard, and then they click on it, they go into My Activity, and that is where they will click and then see this happen, that they, by accepting the invitation, they are agreeing to share information. They'll click Continue, they'll see the onboarding videos, and then they will see their identity information. And again, so this should be the parent information that's listed here. If they need to change something, they need to go to the FSA ID and make the updates there, and then wait for those to be matched, and then come back and finish, do the FAFSA part. This is where parents right away, again, will provide consent. So just like the students, they have to provide consent, even if they're non-tax filers. Then you're going to provide some information. The parents are going to provide some demographic information about themselves. You can see the parent section is much shorter. They're going to provide their marital status, their legal residence, and then they're going to provide their finances. So it's going to ask them some questions about federal benefits received. The reason for these questions comes back to the assets. So remember a few moments ago, I talked about there were some scenarios where assets would be excluded. Assets are excluded whenever someone can answer yes to any one of these questions, okay? So if a parent says, yes, we get Maine Care, which is Medicaid in Maine, then automatically no asset questions will be asked for the parents, and the asset information provided by the student will be ignored. Now, I do want to just clarify, I hate to revisit this one, but for the free and reduced lunch one, they changed the guidance on that. So you can only click the free and reduced lunch one if you qualify for free and reduced lunch based on your income. If your school has universal free and reduced lunch, you cannot automatically check yes to that question. But again, checking yes to any one of these results in assets being ignored. So as far as parents' tax filing status, they're going to provide, whether or not the parent filed a 22 tax return with their current spouse. And if they say yes, then they will have their tax information come over automatically, okay? Then they are going to see some questions about family size. Now, one of the things that we want to do in this case, you can see we have Margot here. This is Jess's daughter. Thank you, Jess, for doing the FAFSA and getting us screenshots. It's going to ask about family size. I don't like that this is worded the way that it is. It basically says, is the parent's family size different from the number of individuals claimed on the 22 tax return? And I want you in every scenario to say yes, okay? Even if you think it is the same, I want you to say yes in all cases. And that's because it's going to give you the opportunity to answer the family size questions. And we want to be sure that the family size is correct. So you're going to say yes to that, which will provide you the opportunity to enter in your current family size. Now, what you want to notice is based on the answers to the questions so far, they already know that there are at least 3 in the family, right? There's mom and dad or parents, could be 2 moms. So there's them and the student. So they already know that there are at least 3 people in the family because the student is always included in the family size, even if they don't live at home. They're always included in the family size. So here you would list anybody else. So let's just say the student has 2 younger siblings, then you would enter 2 here, which is going to get you, guess what? A family size of 5. Okay, and it will update automatically. You're also going to list the number of people in that family who are going to be in college for the upcoming year, okay? So in many cases, it's 1, it's just the student. But if you had multiple kids in college, you would list more than that. But keep in mind, the student aid index is no longer divided by the number, but they do still ask the question, And schools will have that information, and you could follow up with the schools and do an appeal based on the fact of, I've got 3 kids in college. Can you help me with this? That's an appropriate thing that we would want you to do. All right, I am watching the clock and I know we're behind, but just hold tight. I appreciate your attendance. And remember, if you need to leave, this is being recorded, so you could pick up the rest of it by watching the recording. All right, so if parents' tax information was found, then all they're going to see are these 2 questions. Okay, so that's great. This is why the FAFSA has become so much easier to complete. But if there's a situation where they didn't provide consent, their FSA ID was not authenticated, or if their marital status and their tax filing status are inconsistent, then they will have to enter their tax information manually. So let's just say that we have a situation where the parent in 22 was not married. So they filed, let's say, a head of household tax return. But now, last week, they decided to get married. So their marital status on the FAFSA is married. Okay? And guess what? As Nikki referred to as being the step parent's information is required, even if the step parent just became the step parent last week. But in that situation, what's on file is a head of household tax return for mom in this situation, and for new stepdad, maybe a head of household tax return. And you can't combine the 2. Okay? So whenever marital status is inconsistent with tax filing status, people are going to have to enter their income information manually. This can be a good thing, because let's say the scenario is that mom is the parent on the FAFSA and she and student's dad have recently divorced. Okay? But in 22, they filed a joint tax return. She's going to indicate that her current status is divorced. She's going to have to manually enter her information, but she only has to provide her information. I hope that makes sense. Okay. If that doesn't make sense, one of my team jump in and clarify, or someone else clarify. Okay. But most of the time, hopefully, information is going to come over from the tax return, making the FAFSA so much easier to complete. But again, it's not going to be displayed. If parents do have to provide asset information because either they couldn't answer yes to one of those questions, or their income is above 60,000. Below 60,000, usually people don't have to provide asset information, but there's a few other questions they have to answer. But let's just say this is a scenario where they couldn't answer yes to any of the means tested benefit questions, and their income is over 60,000, then they will see the asset questions. A weird thing, one of the asset questions that's first asked is, was there any child support received? I know that seems confusing. What happened there is they wanted to still capture this information, but there's nowhere else to put it, they thought this was the best place to put it because there's not untaxed income information that has to be provided on the FAFSA by and large anymore. So they put that question here. If you do have someone that is receiving child support, they need to include that and list that here, and they need to list it for the last tax year that they received it. So here's a little bit of a confusing point, okay? So for this FAFSA, a 24-25 FAFSA, it's 2022 income information, right? Except if you're providing child support. Because 2023 is done, and that was the last completed year, you'd actually provide child support for 2023. And I know that's confusing, okay? So that's the one exception to income being for 2022. So they're going to list the same other assets, cash savings checking, net worth of investments, 529 plans would be listed here, for example, and business and investment farm would be listed here. Now, this throws everybody off, okay? So we talked about when a student is doing the invite, we only want the invite sent to one parent, okay? So when the student did the invite, they listed, let's just say mom in this situation, okay? So they listed mom's information, and that's what resulted in the invite being sent, and that got the 2 sections of the parent and student FAFSAs connected. But mom's married. They still need dad's information. Dad does not need to sign in with an FSA ID, but dad's information is still required, his demographic information specifically, okay? So people are thrown by this and they're like, well, I thought only one parent needed an FSA ID in a scenario where parents are married and file a joint tax return. Only one does. But you still have to provide demographic information for this other individual. And that basically is to confirm that that's the individual that was on that joint tax return. Okay? So this is required even when parents are married and even when they file a joint tax return. But mom, in this scenario, can fill this in on behalf of dad. Dad does not need to log in with an FSA ID. So we're done. So the FAFSA, except for signing, will then show the parent the summary. Notice that they have really divided up what the student can see and what the parent can see. So no longer can the parent see the answers to the student questions. Okay, they can only see theirs, but they can click on this, they can review them. But then what they're going to do is they're going to click continue, and that is where they are going to click the box and then sign and submit after they've read everything, of course. So you'll notice the difference is the parent is the second person to complete the FAFSA. The student did theirs first, so they only could sign it, but the parent has the option to sign and submit. When the FAFSA is submitted by the parent, they will see this. They will see that the FAFSA is complete. The student will get an email, and the student will get an email that will include the SAI, the student aid index, if one was able to be calculated. Okay. The parent will never get an email with an SAI. And I know that's frustrating to parents. Only the student gets an email with the SAI, again, assuming one could be calculated. So this is what that email looks like, just the heart of it. It basically shows when it was submitted and it shows the SAI. But again, only the student got that. But if you're looking for it, the email is from the U.S. Department of Education with a subject line of "We received your FAFSA form." So when that parent is frustrated and they can't figure out where to find the SAI, because they need it for that wonderful Worthington scholarship, what they can do is they can, with their student, log into their student's email and search based on that subject line or sender. All right. So take a breath for a moment and see any questions about anything that's absolutely critical that we need to address.
I've got a quick question. The question that has to do with the family size. In the scenario that you have, so you have your own natural child who is a college student.
Mm-hmm.
You also are housing a refugee who is a non-citizen,
mm-hmm.
who is unaccompanied,
mm-hmm.
who is also going to school.
Mm-hmm.
So they are considered independent because of their avenue that they go through when they're filling out the FAFSA. But when the parent is filling out for the natural child and comes to that question.
Yeah, no, totally get your question, Katie. So yes, for family size, if they are providing more than half of that refugee student's financial support and will continue to for the designated period of time, they will still list them in their family size. Because it's really coming down to, who's in that family, and behind the scenes, what it figures out is how much of an income protection allowance does that family get, which comes down to who are they supporting financially. Okay. All right. Well, in the essence of time, and know that I will stay on for as long today as you want me to at the end. So if you want to hang with me all day, we'll be here all day. I will be. I'm not going to speak for the others. I won't do that to them. But let's continue on and talk about after the FAFSA is submitted. So the FAFSA has been submitted and a student wants to go and check on the status of their FAFSA. So what you're going to see here is when I log into my FAFSA, and Nikki showed this earlier as well, or Flo did, we have many options that exist. So we automatically go to our dashboard, but I can go directly to my activity, my aid, my documents, and this is again where the settings were. Okay, so remember those options always exist anytime you log in with your FSA ID. But it's taking me to the dashboard automatically. This is my real account. I did a real FAFSA for myself just so I could go through the process, and I did a fake one that I can't submit because it was fake. Okay, so I can see that my FAFSA has been processed, and I'm not going to panic that it shows a submit date in June, even though I did it in January. Okay, so I'm going to click on That's a hyperlink there. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to take me to this form. I am now on the My Activity page, okay? So the status tracker, which is cool, and I like how this is working, only shows here the most recent transaction, okay? So what you're seeing here, I got to move my little thing a little bit here. So what you're seeing here is that I started a correction on June 3rd and probably didn't submit it initially, and it was processed on June 21st, okay? That's what these dates reflect, is my third submission where I made a correction. So don't panic, because a lot of things have deadlines, and just know that this is the most recent transaction. So you're going to see that shows all of that, shows the FAFSA submission summary. But look what happens if you go down to the bottom of this page. So when you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you can see all of your submissions. So I can see here that I actually did my initial FAFSA and submitted it on January 3rd. Okay. So if people are concerned about, did we meet a deadline? Did we get our initial FAFSA in on time? This is where you can see, just scroll down to the bottom of that page and you will be able to see that. When you look at the actions, when under the actions, the 3 dots, maybe there's 4 even there, and you click on those, basically you will be able to see, you'll see the option to make a correction or to view the FAFSA submission summary. So let's just say, for example, I wanted to compare what I initially submitted with maybe my school made some corrections. I could do that. I could look at transmission number 1 or submission number 1 and submission number 2. Probably not needing to happen for most people, but I just wanted you to know that's where you can find that original submission date. Now, when making corrections, what you're going to see, so we're back to kind of where I was a moment ago. I'm on the activity screen. Under actions, when you click on these dots, you have 3 options in this scenario. You can either add or remove a school, you can make corrections, or you can view your FAFSA submission summary. So what I've done for this first one is I clicked on add or remove a school. Let's just say I want to add a school to my FAFSA. I click on that. I get this before you start information. The FAFSA does not get updated with other information like asset information. You don't update anything. You only correct information. Okay, so the FAFSA is kind of a point in time. So basically, this wants to let people know that you're not going through. I remember Orono said they had a student one year who kept updating their asset information all the time, just kept going into their FAFSA. No, 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 no. Static point in time, correct mistakes, but don't continuously update unless you're wanting to add or delete a school. Okay, so this is just letting them know that's the way it should be. Here's where I can go and I can add my schools and walk through it just like I did when I originally did my FAFSA. Now, let's just say, for example, that I started a correction, and maybe I started a correction just because I wanted to see how the correction process worked. I didn't actually want to make one. I just wanted to kind of come into the FAFSA and see it. So you can see here that the FAFSA menu option, if you just click on those 3 dots, has several options available to me. I can get help, I can review my answers, or I can delete my correction. So let's just say I started a correction. I really didn't mean to. I don't know what I want to do, or I'm having trouble getting it submitted. I can delete my correction. Okay, so that is an option that exists, or I can exit out of the correction process and come back later. So again, the other options here to make a correction or to view my FAFSA submission summary, what you're going to see here is if I click on make a correction, I have these options. I can again add or remove a school. Multiple ways to getting to some of these processes sometimes. There's not just one pathway, there's multiple ways. So I could have clicked on make a correction and add a school this way. Or I could update answers to my questions. I should say correct in my opinion, but that's just me. Or I can update my contact information for my contributor. So those are options that I have. If I select those, I go back into the FAFSA and I can make any of those adjustments. If I simply want to view my FAFSA submission summary, I can click on that. And when I click on that, I'm going to see my eligibility overview. I'm going to see my answers if I click on that tab. I'm going to see my school information if I click on that tab, or I can see what the next steps are. Don't be panicked by the exclamation mark in red, basically. Everyone shows that way. It doesn't mean that there's something critical that is required. Always check next steps, but don't view that as a warning that there's something wrong, okay? So down here is where you would see the student aid index. So on the FAFSA submission summary is where you will see the student aid index. So in addition to it being sent to the student only when their FAFSA was submitted and they got that email confirmation, the other place, and this is where people are usually going to be looking, is in the FAFSA submission summary, because this is, after the FAFSA is processed, a much more reliable student aid index. So those are the screenshots for the correction process. And just a few more tips that I want to mention or reiterate. You've got to make sure that the FSA ID information matches exactly. It's absolutely critical, except for email address. If you're having trouble, try using a different browser. There are many approved browsers, but I'm noticing, for example, I often use Edge. Edge was working fine. When I log into Edge, my FAFSA is not there. When I log into Chrome, it is. So if you're having any troubles, try using a different browser. Try clearing the cache. Try using incognito mode. Don't be afraid to delete an unsubmitted FAFSA and start over. And the same with corrections. If it's just not working and you're hitting all these errors, one of the things we will do is we'll just go up under the FAFSA menu and we'll just delete the FAFSA, or we'll just delete that correction. The good thing about the FAFSA now is it's really not that hard to complete. You maybe don't want to start over, but if you cannot get through, then and get that FAFSA submitted, then sometimes just deleting it and starting over is the best course of action. Other things you can try when you delete it is maybe have the other person start it. So if the student started it, try having the parent start it. Or you could also try using that link on that confirmation page that I mentioned, where the student can complete information for their parents or vice versa. All right. I threw so much information at you. I know that I did, but I also want you to have it in one location. You will get all of these screenshots, and it is being recorded. So you can go back in anytime and watch pieces of this there where maybe I went too fast or you want to recall what I said. So that is why I just thought it was more important today to get a lot of information in, even if it seemed a bit overwhelming. So I hope not too much so. So Jess, I think, can you go ahead and stop recording?